All right, time to get our next panel discussion up on the dais. The topic this time around is athlete marketing. Please welcome back Senior Associate at Mint Ellison, Cassandra Heilbronn, who has a whole new panel.
That was kicking people's asses and doing it in spectacular fashion. And, he's got that thing, whatever it is. He's got talent, obviously. He's got speed, excellent striking technique, excellent wrestling and jiu-jitsu, but he's also got that thing. It's hard to figure out what that thing is, but you know when people have it.
Marcus Brimage, Conor McGregor, and here we go. Out of Conor's 12 wins, 11 are knockouts. An uppercut there, Kenny. This is why everyone's been talking about Conor. It's all over. Conor McGregor, another first-round win.
David, 60 G's, baby!
You've been very stoic there with the sunglasses, kind of just looking ahead, not really reacting too much. What's going through your mind right now?
Not much, There's two things I really like to do, and that's whoop ass and look good. And I'm doing one of them right now. And Saturday night, I'm gonna do the other.
So there we have Conor McGregor and his thing. So undoubtedly he's one of the leaders in athlete marketing in terms of what he's done with his personal branding and image. And this afternoon we're going to take a few things that have been discussed over the last couple of days and bring it back to the athletes. We mentioned earlier the clubs, number one assets. The clubs want to support them. The sponsors want to invest in them, or as we say in legal speak, exploit their image. And fans hopefully want to grow up to be them. Australia's sporting market is a little bit different to other countries, as we've spoken about. We've got the restrictions with salary caps and third-party marketing restrictions due to federations, which Sam mentioned earlier. But at the end of the day, the smart athlete is one that can create a renewable source of income long after their playing days are actually over. And how they can do that or what they can do to capitalise is what we're going to talk about today. And I'm joined by some amazing panellists, and I'll get them to introduce themselves. I guess we're starting with you, Andrew.
Hi, back up again. Andrew Baxter, I'm a senior advisor at KPMG. Previous to that, I was CEO at Publicis and Ogilvy, two of the big advertising agencies, and I've had a bit of a background in sport on some of the boards. Sit on the advisory board of the NBL, as well as I used to chair Melbourne Aces in the Australian Baseball League, and have had some involvement with St Kilda Footy Club in the past as well.
Thanks for having me here today. Rod Harys, I was previously CEO of the Sydney Kings, then moved across as Chief Commercial Officer at Volleyball Australia. Then I moved over the rights holder side with Hello World Travel, and more recently I've started a little startup business called Fan Plus, which is fan engagement, so creating experiences money can't buy, can buy experiences for sporting clubs and athletes to connect with fans. So Qantas selected our platform out of 500 global applicants back in July, and we've been working with Qantas over that the past 3 months in that startup program.
I'm Georgie Maynard. I'm a market research consultant. I've been doing so for 20 years nearly. And I've been director at True North Research since 2010. And just recently this week, we've launched Benchmark, which is the 2018 Benchmark report, which evaluates our emotional connection to sport and sponsors.
Perfect. All right, Rod, starting with you, you've just highlighted you had a bit of an interesting career, sports administration, and now I guess the entrepreneurial side of things with your personal venture. So what have you seen what do you see as being the main driver in organisations for their strategies in terms of marketing focus on athletes, engagement with the clubs and federations, and what are you doing with Fan Plus in that area?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really important part for clubs to engage, and a couple of great examples are, what the Sydney Kings have just done recently, and obviously the NBL getting behind it with Andrew Bogut. Their first game, I believe it was, one of the biggest games that the, Kings have ever had in history, and they really got, behind it with Andrew's brand, but also Andrew himself engaged with the public and got behind it in the media. So there was a lot of interest with his signing. So I think it's really important for clubs to engage with athletes. A good example, when I was at Volleyball Australia, it being a sort of third-tier sport, a challenger sport, it's not a big sport in Australia, we had to find a strategy on how to get our brand out there, and we were going into an Olympic Games, Rio 2016, and we put a lot of focus around our women's beach volleyball team, and that where that got us was we were able to secure a major naming rights sponsor. We got various deals done. It was the first time volleyball ever had a naming rights sponsor, and it was purely around the athlete marketing position that we took.
And what about with Fan Plus? What are we seeing you do in that arena at the moment?
Yeah, so what we've done, as you mentioned, highlighted earlier, look, there's a lot of brands out there and businesses that do want to connect with sporting clubs or athletes, and they may not have the budgets, or they may not want to sponsor a club across a whole season. So to cherry pick and do a few key unique experiences across a year, that's what we wanted to create. We wanted to create a centralised marketplace for all sports and also current retired athletes to go on our platform, purchase an experience and connect with their fans.
Great. Andrew, overseas, we see more and more the rise of the celebrity athlete, and we've just showed that clip of Conor McGregor. What are your views on athletes being that salesperson for the clubs and federations, and how can that work in Australia's market?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this morning around a report that KPMG had done around, which is called Ronaldo Economics, and I'll quickly go into a bit of detail of that because I think it helps answer the question. Then I'll talk about Australia and the likes of Andrew Bogut and the Kings. But that deal for Ronaldo was €340 million over 4 years. And the average of those big signings per revenue of those clubs in Europe is about 22%. So, clubs are being able to find a profitable way of spending about 22% of their revenue to bring in these star athletes. Now, Ronaldo was at about 28%. The year before, when Neymar went across, that was about 42%. So they were using a huge amount of their budget to do that. What they're seeing is that there's sort of four main revenue streams that a lot of people in this room know about. What that report showed was, it can be quite a risky proposition, but it also could be a hugely successful proposition. You got your match day ticket sales, and I think that report showed that anywhere between 8 million and 23 million euro a year it would go up by. The broadcast rights obviously are done differently over there, and the club can control that. And there was clearly some upside potential there. Sponsorship, they predicted, was going to go up between 25 and 33 million euro a year. And then the merchandise side, which I think people think is going to be the biggest side, but it was only between 12 and 20 million. But the potential upside was about 130 million on the high side and about 20 odd million on the low side. So it still could potentially lose money, but it could also make them a lot of money. And I think these athletes also bring clearly a personality to it, but they also bring their social media following and things like that. And I know there's some arguments at the moment about how much of that social media group you can reach. But as an example, Ronaldo has got 332 million followers on his social media, and the whole of Juventus had 55 million. So you're bringing 6.5 times the audience just by bringing a player like that along. So they're just some of the little things that I'm seeing. And, if I think about the big ones that have happened here and not knowing the numbers behind them, but, Andrew Bogut and the Kings, you look at Lance Franklin going to the Swans, I think these have proven to be quite successful already. So.
Yeah, and Georgie, you've mentioned you were involved in the 2018 benchmark study, and it's all in front of you today. It's been released this week. We've seen a bit of social media about that. One factor that this report looks at is that of emotional connection. So can you tell us a bit more about why emotion matters and how it relates to fan attachment to athletes?
Sure. So we know that emotions drive behaviours. If you think, first of all, about yourselves and the individual attachment you might have to an athlete or a team, if you think about the reasons why you follow that individual, they'll be bound up in a whole raft of reasons, but some of those at their core will be about trust, about respect, pride, enjoyment, and the bond that has developed between you and that individual over time. And we've looked at those relationships, and the more engaged you are with an individual, the more likely you are to then engage with, more likely you are to pay to watch that individual on TV, the more likely you are to buy merchandise, the more likely you are to engage with that individual sponsor. So the crux of it is emotional connection drives those dollar-driven behaviours that as a sponsor or as an organisation you want to see from your team or athlete. And when we did our our benchmark survey, the top team that came out was the women's rugby sevens team. They scored very highly on trust and respect. And Melbourne Storm was another team that did particularly well, and they are doing really well on a whole host of different areas in terms of engaging people from their fans, getting supporters along in a non-rugby league city. They engage fans and supporters from interstate, and they have a very strong leadership, both from the owners, the management, the captain on the field, and that strong engagement with individuals is important that we see in teams, and we see it with individuals. So for an individual, if you want to grow, to get people to engage with you and to follow you, then you need to grow that emotional connection to you. And that means being trustworthy. That means engendering respect and engendering pride.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective to look at. And Rod, I've got a couple of questions I want to ask you about athletes and their focus. And often we hear how athletes want to directly market with their fans. A lot of that involves giving back to the community, and sometimes it's in their own time and certainly their own costs. I've heard many stories of athletes having to purchase the club's jerseys and then go around and get everyone to sign it so they can auction it off for a selected charity. How do you see clubs actually helping athletes more in capitalising on this engagement opportunity? Do they need to have set strategic offices? What's your experience been?
Yeah, look, I think it's clubs and the athletes working closely together in collaboration and maximising both their brands. You know, I've been across at a couple of sporting clubs that a few athletes went out by themselves and we as a club didn't even know, and we got called up and said, oh, we've seen so-and-so running a clinic. Can we find out more information? And we actually had no idea as a club. So I think, you know, athletes want to do more of it and end up going out and doing it. But I think if they can, obviously there's a lot more collaboration with the clubs and the athlete to support each other and maximise both brands. I think it's a win-win for both the club and the athlete. And we know athletes want to do more. Just a quick example on my platform, we've got Adam Treloar, you know, current Collingwood player, offering a personal training PT session with him at a very reasonable price. And for him, he wants to connect with his fans. He wants to show them an experience, and it's all about fan engagement and connecting with their fans out there.
So, Andrew, if I turn to you, so from a corporate sponsor's perspective, what does an athlete need to do in order to invest in building their brand? Should they be finding a mentor? Should they be engaging with a consulting company? What are you seeing in this space?
There's been a lot said around personal branding as a topic, and there's an interesting thing around a question around why brands want to become more like people and people want to become more like brands. And I think, I'm not sure you need to go to a firm as such, but I do think some of the classic brand theory that we use in marketing for growing brands can very easily be used for your personal brand. And there's a great model, very simple model with a little bit of marketing theory that a guru called David Acker talks about, and it's about brands are built on differentiation, so how different you are, relevance, how relevant you are, esteem, which is a sense of popularity and quality, and then knowledge, how well do you know, not just awareness, but how well do you know somebody. And if I use someone like a Kevin Rudd as an example, before he became Prime Minister, we thought, well, this guy's quite different, he speaks Mandarin, and we've seen him on the telly, and he seems to be quite relevant, and understands us as people, and he became quite popular, and we seem to know about him. And obviously 4 years later, I think how different we felt he was and how relevant we felt he was and how popular he was, etc., in those measures had gone down. And I think athletes can use some of these simple frameworks that brands have used for a long time in their personal branding and switch that across. So, I think I'm thinking about off the top of my head someone like a Steve Smith, you could go through the same process with him around those four pillars and unpick sometimes where a person can become a better brand or fix some things that they might not have or where they're in danger of ruining potentially their brand by not looking at these sorts of things. So.
Sounds as though athletes almost need to treat themselves as their own organisation in order to, develop and grow. And I guess, Rod, you would see a lot of this from your various roles. And putting aside, any league requirements or club deals that they have to pay, be part of. What are some of the things that the athlete should be thinking about in terms of selecting a third-party sponsor? It can be so easy for a particularly a younger athlete just to say yes straight away to the first opportunity that walks in their door, but it could restrict them in years to come. So what sort of advice would you have for athletes in that space?
Yeah, look, I think it's really good management, and certainly, you know, a good due diligence process on that brand, the brand fit, the alignment. You want it to come across as a natural fit. There's probably a lot of examples out there that, as you mentioned, people jump on a brand, they see the dollar signs and think this is great, but it may be damaging to their brand down the track, or it may come across as a fabricated opportunity or brand partnership. Where I think if they're more the natural fit, there's passion between that athlete and that brand, so it does come across natural, and I guess the longevity in that particular brand partnership. You look at the likes of Federer, Beckham, they've got long-term sponsors that have been with them for a very long time, and they sign long-term deals, so I think it works well for them, and it also works well for that brand.
Georgie, so looking at value for money from a sponsorship dollar perspective, often when I'm reviewing sponsorship agreements, the companies are asking for specific athletes that they want access to. More often than not, it's not actually the captain or the marquee player that they are requesting be part of this deal. So from that sponsorship perspective, what can athletes do to make themselves, I guess, that go-to athlete for someone?
Well, I think firstly, if I was a sponsor, the first thing I'd be looking at is not, as you say, the player that is the marquee player or the biggest player. I'd be looking for the player that has the strongest emotional connection. And when we looked at the teams, and we'll be looking at athletes next year, when we looked at teams and looked at the drivers of emotional connection, the things that actually drive someone to connect with an individual, we found that those drivers differed depending on the league. But 3 consistent drivers that you could use as an athlete were demonstrating resilience, demonstrating sportsmanship, and working hard. So if I was an athlete, I would be making sure that both on the field and off the field that I'd be promoting those aspects of my behaviour. The other aspect that we looked at was entertaining. We had one question in the benchmark thing about athletes, and it was which was most entertaining to watch. And in the top 15, we had Steve Smith at number 3, we had Nick Kyrgios at number 13, and we had Dave Warner at number 15. And what's interesting about this, and actually, unfortunately, there was no women in the top 15. There was a female, and if you want to know who that is, and you want to know who came number 1, come and find me afterwards. But what's interesting about being entertained to watch is that doesn't necessarily translate to emotional connection. Obviously, everyone's interested in who's entertained to watch. But if you look at the team's perspective, the Tigers and the AFL, they score very highly on being entertained to watch. Them number 9, but actually overall they sit lower because those other values are important. And likewise with Carlton, who had a disastrous season, sorry Carlton fans, last year, and scored lowly on being entertaining to watch. Their emotional connection is much higher because it's the other things, it's the long-standing value and heritage that's associated with that team. So in their overall score, their emotional connection is higher. So if I'm an athlete, I'm not going to just look for the obvious things. I think it's really important as an athlete to be authentic and to be trustworthy and gender those qualities. And if you could do that and your performance is strong as well, then your brand can soar.
It's really interesting that you mentioned Carlton. I've seen over the past week or so all the sponsorship renewals coming through, and particularly with a number of AFL teams, it's not necessarily linked to on-field performance. Sponsorship news have focused on that quite a bit. And I guess, Andrew, what are you seeing in terms of sole indicators or sole drivers for this corporate sponsorship for teams and athletes? It used to only be the measurables from on-field. So what are you seeing off-field happen?
Yeah, and obviously we talked a little bit about this morning, and I think the ROI around things like sales, direct sales attributed to that sponsorship are very important. I think some things like the emotional connection are also important, but I think also this whole sense of community that clubs and brands are looking for, getting back involved in the grassroots. What are some of those leverageable parts of a sponsorship that they can tap into? I think there's some important things that sponsors can look out for, and I think that align with clubs' values, because a lot of the clubs now are running community programs and things like that. So it's not just we talked a lot this morning about ROI meaning sales. I think there's also an ROI from a community and social sense as well.
Rod, we've spoken briefly via email about US organisations that are focused solely on athlete marketing. There's DA Athlete Marketing, and they are solely responsible for NBA and NFL athletes, all of their personal branding, the media relations, basically organising these athletes' lives. We know Australia's market is completely different. There's not necessarily as much money to be spent in the Australian market. So from your experience with launching Fan Plus, what do you think Australia needs in terms of an organisation that has that point of differentiation for athlete marketing? Do we need a service such as DA Athlete here, or what do you see happening?
Yeah, look, good question, interesting. Look, you're seeing more and more now. If you think back, sports 5-10 years ago, the size of certain clubs, resources in clubs now, there's a lot more attention around, social media. There's a lot more attention around media itself in ensuring that the players are ticking all the right boxes. But you're also seeing that there's a lot more PR agencies or other type of branding agencies that are linking up with individual athletes, or those athletes linking up with them to build their own brand. So you're seeing it more and more. And Andrew, you mentioned a company that you've dealt with in the past that solely focuses on that brand building and helping athletes, but also celebrities and personalities build their brand, put a social media strategy plan together to help them, with their brand positioning in the marketplace.
Perfect. And just a reminder, if anyone does want to ask a question of the panel, just use the MIS2018 hashtag and we'll be able to feed it through. So Georgie, you've mentioned a lot about the positive reactions in the report, and we mentioned earlier the top 4 were the female teams. Sunshine Coast Lightning, I believe, came in as number 1, and we actually had their captain, Seabass, as a speaker here at Money and Spawn a few years ago. Such a big impact. She's an amazing woman on stage. But when we are looking at that female or the women and girls sports, particularly with that top 4, is that higher reaction or that higher emotion coming from the younger fan engagement, or is it still being driven, I guess, by the parents or the money spenders? So that positive reaction, how's it being measured?
So we measure positive reaction to, there's a couple of things we're talking about. So the top 4 teams in emotional connection were women's teams. And then when we looked at the sponsor reactions, for all 62 teams, what were the positive reactions towards the sponsors? And we measure positive reactions being positive sentiment towards the team, increased consideration of those sponsors, positive sentiment towards the sponsor, increased consideration of the sponsor, increased usage, more frequent usage of that sponsor, or using that sponsor for the first time. And when we measured those scores, the top 5 teams were all netball teams in terms of those positive sponsor reactions. And yes, that is related to a younger audience, because what we also see is that netball has one of the youngest audience profiles. I think the only one that had a younger one was esports and the Super W profile. So they have a younger audience, and we also see that in terms of sponsor reactions, positive sense. Sponsor reactions, we see that the younger audiences are the ones that are engaging with sponsors. And that makes sense. As a younger audience, you may not have made up your mind about a sponsor. You may be looking for that authority and that assurance that a sponsor provides. And so you're looking for those cues, whereas older audiences have made up their mind.
That's really interesting, because, Rod, I wanted to speak to you, about different games and approaches by clubs. We go to watch the female cricket, AFL, or the football, and you see all the young kids lining up to get the autographs. They don't see things through a gender lens. They're just so happy to be engaging with an elite athlete, male or female. What have you seen clubs or the sponsors do in terms of strategic change in engaging with those female athletes, and I guess changing the perception of some about elite women athletes?
Yeah, look, it's you've seen some great stories around the women's AFL. They've done a great job in building that brand with sellout crowds and creating heroes in their own sport. You've seen it in cricket. You've seen it in basketball, a few other sports. Look, I think it's good marketing and storytelling. When I was at Volleyball Australia, we had a fantastic athlete, Indigenous athlete, the first professional Indigenous beach volleyball player, Talika Clancy, and 22 years old, was from Kingaroy in Queensland. Really nobody knew anything about her, and we created a whole story around her upbringing, where she came from, her Indigenous background, and she became a hero in that sport and was very successful. She had the biggest serve in the competition, and that attracted sponsors. So we got Woolworths on board, as a personal sponsor with Talika and a few other brands because of that storytelling. So I think it's really highlighting their stories and having that emotional connection with the player and their fans.
And Andrew, what are you seeing in that space?
I think if we think about those perfect brand fits, I agree. I mean, they are, there's no gender lens on them at all. I think if it makes sense, I mean, always the best arrangements are those like the Michael Jordan with Nike, because it's so obvious that they're the shoes and they're the outfits that he's wearing. So I think sometimes when we look at sponsorship with athletes, it's actually easy to bring it back to the basics. I mean, I think in a digital world, we do get caught up in a lot of the metrics, and that's fantastic. But at the same time, sometimes the most simple things are the ones that resonate. And I mentioned before those 4 pillars, but relevance is the number one. I mean, if, you need to have a relevant fit between your brand and that athlete. And if I think through Glenn Maxwell and a cricket bat, or a cricket bat sponsor, then it starts drifting a little bit. A Ricky Ponting with Swiss, you go, okay, he's got a busy lifestyle, I get the vitamins might help him, and then you go one step further where I say you've got to make that leap, which is like a Usain Bolt and Optus, and I almost have to think, what is that link? Well, that link might be speed, maybe. So I think sometimes we can overcomplicate things, and when we try and match up brands and have great athletes associated with us, but those that have got the most relevant fit tend to work the best.
Tend to work quite naturally. And we know athletes' life, sporting life, I guess, is very limited. There's always the joke that NFL stands for not for long. So what do you think that these athletes should be doing to future-proof their careers? Not everyone is going to end up with the sports commentator's gig or commentating the news and things like that. So what should they be doing now, and what are your views on that? I think
it's interesting, because I think someone like the Sydney Swans were first into doing this really, really well, and it was seriously, probably 15 to 17 years ago, when they had a program at the Swans where just every player either had to go to university or have a job outside, doing training every day, when it became a full-time athlete program. And there's certainly some clubs that have followed that path. I think we've seen some of the issues that pop up when athletes have got too much time on their hands and go down different paths. So I do think, helping, you realise that most athletes, one bad year after the age of 30, sadly, they are looking for their next career. And to your point, not everyone can get into the media. So I do think that I think it's a big role of the clubs and the leagues to be helping people out. I think the NRL have always had a very strong, program afterwards, which is, supported by a lot of business people to help to make sure that some of these athletes, remain either employed or on their feet. So I think the clubs and the leagues have got a big role to play in that.
That's really interesting. The AFL, I mean, they've led the way with the rookie contracts. You have to be at university at the same time or studying a TAFE course as well. And then Surfing Australia has implemented similar things. I'd be interested to hear from you all as to whether you think that type of development, once they're out of the rookie years, should be on the athlete, or should the club and corporate sponsors be involved? So what's your views, Georgie?
Well, I think as an athlete, if you want to build your own brand and build your emotional connection with fans, then it is part of your responsibility. You have to acknowledge that that's the way you're going to grow your brand. But I think that you have to also understand that they're not marketers by trade. They don't have the skill set. So of course a league has to come along and has to support them and help them in grow their brand. An anecdotal example I've got is, which I think was quite interesting, we did some qual research when we designed Benchmark, and we spoke to a young 20-year-old male. He is an avid follower of basketball and rugby union. He loves the NBA and follows Ben Simons, and he loves the little 2-3 minute clips that the NBA produces. He loves following the lifestyles of the NBA players, and that's how he's engaged with them. But he really wishes that he sees more of that in Australia, and he's not seeing that. There's only one player that he follows in Australia, and that's Ellia Green. And he is absolutely inspired by her social media that she puts out there. He thinks she's just so impressive. She's strong, she's tough, she's got great conditioning, and he just loves what she puts out there. And I think that athletes have to realise that in order to do that, to grow their brand, they have to do that. And some of the women are doing a fantastic job around this. Lana Kennedy and Sam Kerr are also following suit.
What are your views, Rod?
Yeah, look, I think it's important for clubs obviously to support the athletes for even life after sport. If it's engaging with the sponsors, if they've got financial institutions or other sponsors that are keen to get them involved. The Sydney Swans do it really well with their transition period from players that are coming to the end of their career. They move into a role, and you see a lot of them have moved into roles with their current sponsors, QBE or City, as examples. So I think it plays a big part in the club, the sponsors, and how they progress that athlete for life after football or sport.
And I think also it's just helping some of the athletes understand what some of the skills they've actually got that they may not realise that they can take into the working world, and whether that be leadership or understanding of the role they play within a team, or the interpersonal skills, or I suppose sometimes the competitiveness, because in some businesses that's really important. So I think just giving them that understanding that they are translatable into the business world for a job afterwards is really important.
And just quickly touching on that was a whole piece of the discovery process that we went through with our little platform. Was there's so many athletes, retired athletes out there that were heroes and had a huge following and fan base when they played, and then you've seen sort of the sad stories that some of them do fall into depression, and they do go they're not playing football and they miss that. So part of what we found through that discovery process was these athletes want to still feel relevant. They want to give something back. If they can go and do a coaching kicking clinic with a fan down at the local park as an experience, that's what they want to do. And I guess that was a big part of why we sort of developed Fan Plus, to try and keep them feeling relevant with fans.
Can you talk us a bit about the Fan Plus process? So are the athletes approaching you to come on board? I know you've had the stall out here the last couple of days explaining it to a few people. So do you just want to talk us through rather how it all works?
Yeah, so basically what we've created is a centralised marketplace for all sports. So we obviously want to collaborate with as many sporting clubs. We've got about 14 clubs on board at the moment, and about 50 individual athletes, and it's creating experiences, anything from personal training sessions to playing around a golf to having an NRL player come to a surprise birthday party. So it's really a wide range of varied experiences at different price points. Look, we're getting now that we've got about 100 experiences online now, so it's word of mouth. More athletes are saying, look, I'm on this platform, why don't you sign up? So we're actually getting clubs and athletes approaching us, but we're also out there chatting to clubs and individual athletes as well.
Yesterday we heard from the guys from overseas about using Instagram and Twitter, and Meta had said how he no longer has Instagram as his own personal platform. For us in professional services, LinkedIn and Twitter is something that we need, and we're often connecting with clients and new clients from that. What role do you think social media plays in the athletes' marketing? Is it something they should solely be relying on? Is it a case of they're not on there, they're going to miss out? Or can they still use those traditional forms to gain access, I guess, to consumers and sponsors? So, Andrew, do you want to talk about
look, I think there's no doubt that what those platforms set out to, and I think that's what the guys talked about yesterday, was that you can only get to 10 or 15% reach now of that audience that you've built yourself without paying some more to get to them. So, at some point, that organic reach, so I do think it's a combination of both. I still think you can be utilising your social media, and I see people in the sports world like an Ange Postecoglou, he's very strong on LinkedIn. So I do see people doing that quite well. I also think you need to develop your own platforms. You need to develop your own website. House a lot of the information about yourself in one spot to make sure that if someone's searching for you or something that you're looking to do, that you've built out your own media channels as well. Besides not be 100% reliant on those social channels. But I do still think the influencer marketing, and you look at the rise of things like Tribe and Right Fit here and Scrunch, which are those platforms matching brands with influencers in sport and fashion and other areas, that's still working very strongly, and those companies continue to grow. So I don't think that's quite. I agree that at some point it will plateau off, but at the moment it's still got a little bit to go, I think.
Yeah, and good, good strategic advice around their social media strategies, that they're posting the right things. If athletes are aligned with certain charities or foundations, promote that and talk about that, and tell people about all the good things that they're doing out there across, their platforms. I think it's key, and it's really important for the fans to see what they're doing and engage.
Yeah, you need to have a combination, don't you? Obviously social media can only reach so far, and some teams really struggle because they only have, let's say, the Diamonds only have a much smaller team. They only have so many athletes. But those Diamonds, at the end of those matches, they work really hard. They go and they stay in after the match. They shake every girl's hand. They sign every autograph that they get. And those kind of connections really last a lifetime. And so you influence that little young girl's life, and she remembers the day that she met Caitlin Bassett, and she spent the time to signing the autograph. Dave Warner was actually at my kids' school this week, and usually if my teacher posts something on Instagram that is of my kids' class, I like. Anyway, Dave Warner was on it, so it was a bit of a decision for me to like it or not. But obviously those steps that he's taking in the eastern suburbs in Sydney, around Randwick, where he's playing to try and grow that brand, are things that he'll need to do to get his brand back into the right spot.
Yeah, it certainly is a bit of a conundrum when you see things like that, that's for sure. I want to ask a couple of general questions about what we've seen in the past and where we're going to from here. So I guess for each of you, if you could pick one athlete worldwide from any era to be the global face of sport, who would it be and why? So Andrew, let's start with you.
We were debating this last night over dinner.
Yes.
I narrowed it down to two. I think Michael Jordan's still got huge resonance, and I think there's a whole piece around those that have finished playing and built businesses off the back, and I think the Jack Nicklaus's and Greg Normans were some of the original people to do that, and I think someone like Michael Jordan has up until now, and I think Roger Federer will be the next one coming through.
Yeah, for me, probably Roger Federer. A couple of years back, one of the Sydney Kings owners was really good friends with his agent, and he had a exhibition match here in Sydney, and I got the chance to meet Roger, and I thought, oh, this is awesome, really cool, and a quick photo with him. But I was actually in the back of the sheds with him for half an hour, and he knew what team we were playing the next night, that we'd lost the last 5 games, that we had to win the next night to get to a chance to sort of get to the finals. What players we had out injured. I mean, he was so engaging, and for me, I was quite blown away by going, wow, he didn't have to care who I was. It could have been a quick photo, how you going, see you later. He even invited me to sit down and have a meal with him, so just incredibly engaging. And I think for him, that's his brand. I mean, it's such a great as an incredible athlete at the highest level, but he still gives so much back to fans.
Yeah, well, for me, it would be Billie Jean King. She was a fighter on the court, and she was a fighter and still is off the court for gender equality and social justice. I think Billie Jean King has so many qualities. She's a strong leader. She's courageous. She fights battles. She never gives up. And the interesting thing about her is that she has flaws. And I think with any athlete, an athlete that has flaws makes them relatable and human to the rest of us. So yeah, Billie Jean King's my pick.
It's really interesting.
Oh, I should actually. I would put up one more thing on
Oh,
Billie Jean King.
go.
I have to say is that it was 1973 at the U.S. Open when she fought for equal pay. Over the years, we've had to wait quite a long time for other sports to see equal pay, and in 2004, the tide started to turn, and it's good to see the World Surf League do that in 2019. But 2019 is a long time since 1973, so it just goes to show what a trailblazer she was.
Yes, a number of different faces there. All right, so let's looking forward to the years ahead. What are your predictions for athlete marketing trends from 2019 onwards? So Rod, if we start with you.
Yeah, look, I think it's probably an area where clubs are probably going to have to invest more in, but also the individual athletes. There's a lot of player movement. There's not too much loyalty anymore in sporting clubs, as in players will move, coaches move if they're getting a bigger deal. So I think having their own brands and investing in their own brands, I think is key, and I think we're going to see a lot more of it.
I think, and we talked again a little bit about this morning, but the return on investment, I think, is going to become, bigger and bigger. People will want to understand the short-term return on investment of that sponsorship, and they'll want to of that athlete, and they'll want to understand the longer-term one return on investment as well.
Yeah, and I think here in Australia we're still not taking advantage of technology and how we can harness that with athletes and grow their brand. So I would expect to see a bit more of that. I'd also, in terms of the emotional connection, I would expect to see the sponsorship dollars go towards more that authenticity and emotional connection that certain athletes have, rather than just go for the one that the marquee player with the highest profile who may actually turn out to be quite erratic.
Well, that's really interesting. So I think from here, it's obviously a big connection piece with the athletes in terms of seeing themselves as their own organisation and learning what to do to market themselves, but also making sure their clubs and federations are engaged and making sure they have the support, for life after sport, so to speak. But then, as you've just mentioned, Georgie, making sure there's that connection and taking advantage of technology. So we've got the faces of sport. We've got Michael Jordan, Roger Federer and Billie Jean King. It'll be interesting to see how that changes over the years, particularly with the virtual reality worlds and, I guess, esports coming in. Very interesting session. Thank you all for contributing, and very exciting to see what's happening again. So if you could all join me in thanking our three panellists for today, Andrew, Rod and
Thank you, Cassandra. Cassandra Heilbronn, great moderator. And big thank you to Andrew, Rod, Georgie.